Club, which has been going since '74, I believe. And this is we're beginning our 10th year of a partnership with Teton County Library and the Library Foundation. Our first program at the library was 9 years ago tonight. And I believe we've done 108 programs in partnership with the library. And in recent years, we've been doing it as part of a collaborative effort with Teton Plants and the geologists of Jackson Hole to make Tuesdays Nature and Science Night at the library. And it's been a lot of fun, and I think it's been a great asset to the community. And there are a lot of familiar faces. I just did something that I shouldn't have done, whatever it was. Francis, somehow I'm looking at your screen.
Here, let me undo Francis's.
Yeah.
Now you can share it again.
All right.
You're not screen sharing, it's just you.
Here we go. And this is Susan Patler and Susan Marsh have been doing this program for years. And it's our winter bird identification, and it's a prelude to the Audubon Christmas bird count, which we assist with and have been since 1974. 1970, actually. It started before the Bird Club did. And this year's Christmas bird count will be on Saturday, December 19th. And if you would like to participate, drop me an email at jhbirdclub@gmail.com, and I will connect you with Susan Marsh, and we'll see what we have left for count circles. But here's the story with the CBC, Christmas bird count here. You can see from the, this is the count circle, it's 15-mile circle. And you can see that back when the circle was determined, most of the area down in South Park was not developed yet. And I believe that the circle is centered on the town square. So anything inside the circle counts, anything outside the circle doesn't count. We've had 116 species recorded, which is pretty good for a mountain community. And I think last year we had about 60 people participate. And so that's great. It's a lot of fun. First year I did it, I had 3 species, thanks to the ice fog. So what we do is, this presentation is for selected birds, winter birds of Jackson Hole. Obviously, you all know what the owl is, but tell me, what's the owl eating? First ones we are looking at would be these 2 species. And I'm sure there's always a question about how to tell them apart. The tail is a good way to take a look at it. There's 2 different tail configurations most of the time on these birds. And when you see them in full flight, it can be pretty obvious. Scale is difficult. Dennis, whatever happened here?
Now you can share it again.
All right. And the beak size is also a determinant, but sometimes that can be hard. You can see on the American crow above, fairly short, pointed bill, about as long as the head is long, whereas on the raven, the bill is very heavy, and generally, although this posture doesn't quite show it, generally the bill is a little bit longer than the head is wide. The the tail on the American crow is rounded. The tail in flight on the raven is distinctly wedge-shaped. Two other species that sometimes get confused are the Canada jay, formerly known as the gray jay, formerly known as the Canada jay, and then formerly known as the gray jay. Back to Canada jay. Up in Maine, they call them whiskey jacks. And Clark's nutcracker. So the coloration on these birds is rather similar. The nutcrackers are considerably larger, much bigger bill, and somewhat more distinctly patterned in black and white. And they have a pretty different habit. You'll see nutcrackers basically foraging fairly high and flying a lot at treetop level, whereas the gray jays do a lot of ground feeding. And it has to do with the food choices more than anything else. Now, lately, we've got a few corvids. We don't have corvid 19s here, but we have corvids. And the common one is, of course, the black-billed magpie, and everybody's pretty familiar with that. And we get at feeders, and we get in the forests the Steller's jay, very distinct bird, very beautiful. And in recent years, we've been getting a lot more blue jays, which are not uncommon in the eastern part of the state, but have not been all that common here in the Mountain West. There's some interesting habits going on here. There have been blue jays seemingly hanging around the creeks for quite some time, and they're just now starting to be recognized, and they're starting to flock a little bit with some of these Steller's jays. These two birds are genetically very closely related, and there is evidence, not here, but there is evidence of hybridization and maybe genetic swamping of the blue jay over the Steller's jay. The blue jay seems to be genetically dominant. What's interesting is whatever blue jays are eating here, it's not their usual massed crop of acorns, but they're fairly adaptable, and they seem to be getting along well here. Magpies, as I think we all know, are true omnivores. They're pretty much going to eat almost anything. They're not quite as picky as the Steller's jays, which seem to be dependent on mostly forest insects and forest nuts. And now it's bald eagle season. And you'll notice bald eagles of a variety of plumages and age classes hanging around since we're into hunting season. And they're a good way to find a gut pile is to find an eagle, and vice versa. I don't think we've got a lot of comparison here between juvenile eagles. These golden eagles are, obviously the bill on the bald is very distinctive, as is the white head. These golden eagles can often be mistaken for juvenile bald eagles. They do have some distinguishing characteristics, and one is that the head can look very light. In bright sun, these birds just have very shiny, truly golden heads. And there's a few of them around all year long. So here are some of the young ones. Yep. Beverly?
Oh, well, no, finish with the eagles, and then I have a question.
Okay. You can see that these are younger bald eagles. And this is a kind of typical immature golden eagle. The symmetry is important if you can get a good look at these birds under wings in flight. The golden eagles do have a real symmetry with the white patches. The young bald eagles, just splotchy and, as Susan says, messy. All right, Susan, Beverly.
Back to the blue jay. Does anyone know or has noticed if they seasonally are moving around, or are they here every season in more or less the same places?
I really don't know the answer to that, Beverly. I don't know that we've got a good handle on their seasonality. I know Franz has been paying pretty close attention to them, and Joe, I think you have too, but I'm not sure that we really understand what's going on with the Blue Jays here. Since, I mean, they are definitely feeder birds. So if they can get established in the winter, they'll stay. But I don't think we've got any real data. Buteos. Buteos are basically a family of hawks that includes red tails, rough-leggeds, and the Swainsons, which we don't have in the winter. And red tails are winter here all the time. The rough-leggeds, you can't see it that well here, but if you look it down at these legs, because they are heavily feathered, they're also very short. Rough-leggeds really can't get prey in more than about 4 or 5 inches of snow. So they show up in November before the snow gets deep, and then they clear out. But if you go over to the other side, or if you drive up through the Madison River Valley in Montana, you'll see roughlegs all over the place, partly because the snow cover is not quite as deep because of the open fields. So they'll be foraging in the fields over in Idaho all winter long. They're roughly the same size as the red tails, but one of the things to keep noticing with the adult red tails is white breast, and this band is pretty distinctive, whereas the rough-leggeds are typically much more strongly marked. You see this very dark, wide area on the belly, and then down low, it can be this kind of golden beige. Red-tailed juveniles don't have red tails, but the dark head is there and the belly band is usually evident. We do get a couple of different morphs or color phases of red tails. We get the usual kind of classic red tail, but then we also get these dark morph, these red birds, and sometimes they look almost black. So you can take a look at these. It's not particularly shows here, but the heads are very different most of the time. There are some definitely plumage phases in these birds that can be confusing, but the rough legs are generally pretty light. The red tails always have a dark head. The rough-leggeds, the males and the females are a little different from each other, and the juveniles even more so. But a white-headed bird like this, a buteo, is going to be a rough-legged. In flight, these black patches are called patagial patches on the red tail, and they are diagnostic. If you see these small black patches in close to the body at this portion of the wing, it's going to be a red tail. Whereas the rough-leggeds, they have black patches, the light morph ones do, much farther out, and they're a lot larger. And they've got this very, very dark cummerbund, these very large wrist patches. All right, I knew we were going to get to accipiters. Coopers and sharpshins are not that easy to tell apart. It's a lot easier when they're sitting, but this is not exactly sure which one this is, but I think it's a Cooper's. They both have the same color pattern. There's mostly a size difference and a few minor plumage variations, but they're red underneath, they're barred. These goshawks are gray and they're much larger. And they're also have this very distinctive white eyebrow. And goshawks are as likely to attack you as they are another bird. They are very defensive. Owls. This is the one we mostly see, but there's a bunch of these guys around, the long-eareds. I'm hoping to have maybe have Brian Bedrosian do another owl presentation, or Catherine Gura later this year or in 2021. Long-eareds, they're here. They're quite nocturnal. They don't tend to get up and on a perch and make a lot of noise the way the great horns do, but they do have a wide variety of calls. They tend to stick fairly close to the trunk of a tree, and they kind of look like a gigantic upright pine cone. They're hard to see, but they listen to some long-eared owl vocalizations, and they have a wide variety. The great horned owls are pretty typical in their vocalization, except in mating season when they tend to have a bunch of different calls. They're about the same size, but they have these very distinctive different faces. Everybody's classic, charismatic Jackson Hole bird. If they come here looking for birds, they're looking for great grays. And occasionally, like a couple of years ago, we get a real show. We had 2 of those birds on Spring Gulch, and everybody got to see them. But they're an extraordinary bird. There's really nothing quite like them elsewhere in the U.S. Small winter owls. This is not an owl with a furry tail. This is an owl that is sitting on a red squirrel that it's killed. And it's a boreal. And they were around. I know Patty Riley had one about 2 weeks ago sitting outside her house. And then these pygmy owls, these are very hard to find. They're small, they're secretive, but this is a fairly distinctive facial pattern for the boreal. They almost look like these tiny hawk owls, whereas the pygmy owl looks a little bit more like a flammulated, and they've got the rounded head, and they tend to be much browner. Winter grouse. Well, of course, there are still sharp tails around. There are certainly sage grouse around, but the 2 that are most commonly seen and confused are the dusky and the ruffed. And mostly their habits and their forest choices are different. Duskies tend to inhabit the conifer forest, and ruffs are a little bit more Catholic in their tastes, but you'll often see them in the aspen groves and the cottonwood riparian galleries. You will rarely, if ever, see a dusky in a riparian gallery, and in an aspen grove, only one that's situated in the middle of a heavy conifer forest. Best place to see these dusky grouse, which used to be called blue, easiest place to see them is usually up on Signal Mountain. Rough grouse, generally you walk down the Moose Wilson Road or anywhere with that kind of habitat, and you can hear them booming, and they'll call all during the winter. Whoop. So here's a sage, and we do have sharp tails. There's, I think, more and more of them coming in, particularly out on Antelope Flat seems to be a good place for them. And sage grouse in the winter, they're out there, and generally when I see them, it's usually a flock of females or females with young flying, and sometimes you'll see them walking around on the snow, but they're there. You'd think for a big bird it'd be easier to find. Now this guy, these are gray partridges, and we see them occasionally. They've got a lot more of them over in Teton Valley, but we do get some here. If you see one of these small chicken-like birds walking around out there and you have no idea what it is, it's probably a gray partridge. Shrikes. The winter shrike here is typically the northern shrike, and the nesting shrike is usually the loggerhead. And they seem to do a complete switch. I don't know that there are many records at all of loggerheads in the winter or of northerns in the nesting season. But you'll see a bird sitting up and you'll go, what is that mockingbird doing here? Shouldn't they be somewhere else? And it's going to be a northern shrike. They are hunting small birds. They are a passerine. They're a songbird, but their main prey in the winter is small birds. The ducks. So ducks in winter can be really annoying. And these are lovely plumaged summer birds. But in the fall, most ducks molt in the fall and they go into an eclipse plumage. And then they can be very hard to tell apart. But obviously you get pintails, which are male pintails are utterly distinctive. And gadwalls are a finely vermiculated pattern. They're just lovely birds, but sometimes it's hard to tell them from particularly female mallards. And of course, we've got male and female mallards in this picture. And American widgeon, known to the gunners as bald pates because of this bright white patch on the head, and green-winged teal. These birds are roughly the same size. The widgeons, this is a full plumage, summer plumage male, as is the green-winged teal. But right about now, when you see widgeon, a lot of them are fairly gray, but they have these rather small, distinctive bills and rounded head shape, short necks, and they're actually pretty easy to pick out by silhouette. The teal have a considerably longer bill, even though they're roughly the same size. And you can be very easily confused by the green stripes. That's one of the things that you see the green very easily, and when you think you might be looking at a teal, it's often a widgeon. Widgeons are very common here. Golden eyes. Well, the most common golden eye here is not the common golden eye, it's the barrows. And on a continent-wide basis, the barrows are maybe 10% of all the golden eyes. Here, they're about 90% of all the golden eyes, and the commons are a relatively unusual species. But the distinctive pattern on the male is to look for the crescent shape on the head for the barrows and a coin shape just behind the bill on the common. There are some differences in the head shape. The barrows has more of a kind of pointed head, and the common is got a rounded head. There are, in bright light, you can generally see some color differences in the head. The green often on the barrows and a purplish on the common, but that can be very tricky. These birds are pretty closely related, and because it's a refraction of the light, not an actual pigmentation, you can be looking at a bird with a somewhat purple head and go, well, why has it got a crescent patch? It's a trick of the light. And then another bird that we have pretty common is this is a male ring-necked duck, so-called because of the perfectly obvious ring you can see around its neck, and this very subtle ring you can never see on the bill. I don't know why birds often get named for their least distinctive visual characteristic, but these ringnecks do have, in fact, a dark chocolate ring around their necks. They're quite common. They're really marsh ducks. So I'm not going to try and talk too much about trumpeter swans because I will embarrass myself, especially if Susan Patler is on. But most of the swans that we're going to see here in Jackson, in Teton County, are going to be trumpeters with a few tundras. Once you get over into the valley, you're a lot more likely to see tundras along with the trumpeters. And the trumpeter swan population, the Rocky Mountain population is the one that was so critically endangered. And but about, as this slide points out, about 85% of the trumpeters you see here are actually mostly Canadian birds that have migrated down for the winter. There are a lot more trumpeter swans around here in the winter than there are in the summer. but about 15% of the population are the resident breeders. The best way to tell them apart is to note that these tundras have this rather just always present yellow patch and a gap between the eye and the bill, whereas the trumpeters, the eye seems to just go right into the bill. There are some differences in bill shape and head shape, and a little bit difference in size. Canada geese, I don't think anybody needs a real introduction to them. We don't talk about cackling geese, which may be here, but they're awfully hard to tell apart. There used to be something like 18 recognized subspecies of Canada geese, and then they split out a bunch of the small ones into cackling geese, but it's hard to identify them unless it's breeding season and they're calling. This is a snow goose. We do get snow geese here, and sometimes the blue goose morph, but they're usually the white ones with this very distinctive black patch on them. Great blue heron is an unmistakable bird pretty much everywhere, especially here since we really don't get any of the other large waders. And an assortment of birds you'll see in the water. Over on the upper left, we've got killdeer, which is a very common bird, and dippers, which we'll see all year long, as long as there's stream water. Dippers have a great adaptation. All of these birds have particular adaptations, but dippers have what's called a nictitating membrane. It's essentially an eyelid inside their eyelid. So if you're looking at a dipper and it blinks its eye, it'll flash white. That's the nictitating membrane coming down to protect the eye before the bird goes underwater. They can see through it. It's a pretty amazing adaptation. Coot, everybody's favorite, coot. They get thousands of them on the lake in right around Halloween or between Halloween and Thanksgiving. And occasionally there's a few redhead ducks mixed in. But I've seen flocks of 5,000 or more on Jackson Lake the first couple of weeks in November. Wilson snipe, which you can see pretty handily out at Burt's Bench in the Murie Family Park, wandering along there. You can also see them fairly handily down at Schwebacker's Landing. And they have great displays in the early spring. Real obvious display flight. Tree creepers, brown creepers. We've got one here, and they're distinctive birds, but they're highly camouflaged. They mostly will roost underneath heavy bark trees. And that's where they spend the winter, and then they come out and forage for insects under the bark. Beautiful little birds. The Eurasian collared dove, much bigger bird than the mourning dove, which is a native bird. It's probably not fair to call the collared dove an introduced species. Tony White, the late Tony White, who was a great birder and lived here, was kind of the expert of birds in the Bahamas. And Tony was the one who kind of, helped figure out that these birds were blown over here in a series of storms. They're African birds, essentially, Eurasian birds. And they ended up in the Bahamas, and then they moved over to Florida, and then they took a beeline northwest pattern and spread out from that. They seem to have peaked at their, they were everywhere, and they had a huge population. They seem to have fallen back somewhat, which means they've met some natural limitation on their spread. But they're big birds, and they do appear to be competitive with the native mourning doves. I think we're seeing few of the mourning doves.
Bernie?
Yo.
What I have observed with the collared dove, again, I live kitty corner from the library.
Mhm.
We used to have them nest in the trees out in front of our property, and we'd get a couple of nests in the back. The crows have really, really knocked them down.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of makes sense. Um, you get a bird that nests that often and is a fairly big, fairly large bird. I would imagine there's a fair amount of nest predation going on with the crows.
Well, when the crows here started to nest in the same part of our property that the doves did, well, the doves disappeared.
Yeah. Well, that's what happens. And I suspect that the mourning doves may be meeting similar issues as their area of influence grows, and they seem to be being knocked back a little bit. So, some of these species complexes do adapt to having an additional food source or a competitor for food source show up in the neighborhood, and eventually they figure it out. So here we've got northern flickers, who you may often see sitting on the side of your house and trying to drill a hole in your sideboard. Mostly ground feeding woodpeckers, actually. You'll see them often in the early spring. As soon as the ground, even before the ground's unfrozen, they'll be pecking in the ground, and then they go after ants. And that's essentially what they do, is they're mostly ground feeders. But they are a primary source of nesting cavities for birds all over. Flickers are great excavators, and a lot of birds, chickadees, bluebirds, are utterly dependent on flicker holes as well as the other woodpecker holes. And here are the other woodpeckers, the downy and the hairy. Big difference in the bill size, fairly big difference in the shape, and some plumage differences, particularly in the Rocky Mountain populations, where the hairy woodpeckers tend to be considerably blacker with less spotting and barring on them than the eastern populations. But the head size and relative bill size are really diagnostic. These downy woodpeckers have tiny little bills, about a third the size of the head, whereas the hairy woodpeckers is more a half or a little more. And since they often do us a favor of perching exactly like this on the trees, you can tell them pretty easily apart if you focus on the relative bill length. White-breasted versus red-breasted nuthatches. There are differences in the calls, neither of which I can hear anymore, but I don't know that there's a lot of real difference behaviorally in these birds, but they both will come to feeders. I think the white-breasteds are more common as a feeder bird, and the red-breasteds tend to be a little more secretive. They're somewhat smaller, but they are distinctively marked. The female white-breasteds are somewhat grayer on the head, so that is one way you can actually tell them apart. And the chickadees, the mountains, which don't have anything really on them in terms of beige, except a little bit of a wisp, just a little bit of a wispy beige, where the blackcaps tend to be fairly strongly colored on the belly and the lower breast. And of course, there's a mask. And as the slide says, these two can hybridize, and they probably do more often than we realize. So sometimes you can see a really confusing chickadee, and it's a hybrid. They're very closely related. They're here not particularly separated by habitat, as far as I can tell, but they are mostly feeder birds, as for our purposes, and they're great. These are the alarm calls in the woods. Every critter out there knows when a chickadee sees something dangerous. They are the sentinels of the woodland. House finches and Cassin's finches. Well, house finches are a pretty common bird, and you can see fairly clearly on this male that they The males all have this brown stripe. The head is not uniformly red. And they all have this kind of brown behind the eyes and a collar around the back. Whereas the Cassin's males really look like somebody picked them up and dipped them upside down in raspberry juice. The head is usually fully red. The bills are somewhat distinctively different. Females a little bit harder to tell apart. There's virtually no coloration on a Cassin's female, whereas most of the house finch females have some vestiges of orange or pink on them. Cassins can be very dominant at a feeder over house finches. And then pine grosbeaks. You know, the pine grosbeaks to me always look like their plumage job isn't quite complete, but this is normal. This is a typical male. They're red, they're blotchy. The females, they're not juveniles. They're always this kind of yellow, greenish orange. So you can tell them apart. You can see these birds in pretty large flocks sometimes. I've seen them up around Coulter on the road in a flock of 30 or 40 of them. And I think they're graveling. I think they're mostly taking up grit. Common redpolls, these are eruptive species, but the common redpolls are particularly eruptive in that some years we get none, and some years we get inundated with them. It depends on the pine crop. They tend to follow the pine crop, and they are moved around by the early winter weather. But these guys can come out of Canada by the thousands, and sometimes they'll stay all winter. Sometimes they'll show up for a week. Fabulous birds. I've had one hoary redpoll here, but there's always an argument among taxonomists about whether it's one species or two. Right now, it's still two. Lovely little birds, very distinctive with the tiny yellow bill and the red cap. Pine siskins, pretty much a little brown job, except they've always got a little bit of yellow on the wings and maybe on the back of the tail, and some of them are very yellow on the wings and the tail, but they are mostly brown and streaked as opposed to the goldfinches, which are mostly, this is good plumage males. And siskins travel in fairly large flocks. Goldfinches tend to be closer to the ground. Siskins tend to fly a little bit higher. Crossbills, red crossbills, white wings. And again, this is not an aberration. This is kind of a typical red crossbill. I think the bird that we get the most of here, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we get many more white wings and reds, but sometimes I get them confused. Here again is that kind of color change that you see in the pine grosbeaks as well. The females on the reds here are pretty yellow-green, and the males are more of an orangey red, whereas the white-winged crossbills tend to be quite redder. Again, we can see these guys in fairly substantial flocks flying over. The bill adaptation is extraordinary. It's designed to open up these cones and get the seeds before the seeds drop out. So there's hanging upside down, sticking their bills in, and then they open up this wedge and flick the seeds out with their tongue. It's amazing to watch. Evening grosbeaks, another eruptive species, although we usually have some every year, every season. Commonly known as flying golden piglets because they can clean out your feeder in no time. They are voracious. They're also, the males are utterly distinctive. Junco varieties. I think mostly what we see here are the pink-sided Oregons, and we do get some slate coloreds. There are a number of variations in Junco plumages. And I think if you look at the Fish and Game checklist, I think they've got all three of these listed, and I believe all three of them are listed on the nature mapping list as well. But mostly what we get, particularly as breeders, are the pink-sided Oregons, but we get all of them in the winter. Pink bills. Winter sparrows. House sparrow, extremely common, abundant. And tree sparrows, you know, they're delicate little birds. They tend to occur in small flocks. They're somewhat secretive. They don't come to your feeder, but they will feed on the spillage. Song sparrows, mostly near water in the winter. And there aren't nearly as many of them. I mean, if you go somewhere like down to South Park, song sparrows are abundant in the spring and summer. But in the winter, most of them clear out, but they do hang around near the flowing streams. Oh, and over in Kelly Warm Springs, you can see nice bunch of sparrows in the winter in Kelly Warm Springs. Harris's sparrow, pretty unusual here, but occasionally present, very distinctive, relative of the more common white-throated, although our really common Zonotrichia sparrow here is going to be the white-crowned, which we don't seem to have a picture of. These two are a little less common. Harris is not quite rare, but you don't see him very often. I don't know why we have don't have a white crown, but I'll get that.
Bernie,
Yeah,
the white, I've never seen a white crown here in the wintertime. Plenty of-
yeah. Some of them hang on into the winter, Dennis, but most of them do go south.
yeah, they seem to go south, especially to Southern California from the Bay Area down. There are just tons and tons of them.
Yeah, there's a couple of different populations of white crown. There's actually a couple of different subspecies, and I don't know where our birds actually go. My experience has been that most of the Californian birds, I think, are coming down the Pacific Flyway from Alaska, but I'll look into that. It's a good question. I think most of ours actually may go down towards Arizona. Winter thrushes, we really only have two, the robin and the Townsend's. Townsend's is a great bird, very classic forest bird. I'm not sure I've ever seen more than two together. Robins, of course, they're still sleeping off their crabapple drunkard in the fall. Occasionally, you get a varied thrush, a winter migrant that decides this is as far south as it wants to go. Hermit thrushes with the reddish tail don't hang around in the winter, but they might be late coming through. Bohemian and cedar waxwings. So the Bohemians are typically gray. They don't have any of the yellow markings of the cedars. And they also have this bright rust-colored undertail, whereas the cedars are whitish. And you can certainly get flocks of both. I mean, they get a lot of Bohemians up in Alta. And but I think the more common one in the winter here is going to be the cedar. But always check. There's always a few bohos mixed in with them. Yeah, the open country birds, snow buntings, wonderful little birds, and very hard to get a good look at. They fly over fast and then they hit the snow and they vanish. Lapland longspurs, occasionally mixed in with the snow buntings, and horned larks, pretty distinctive. You'll see a bird with a dark tail flying away from you, and they're chunkier. But if you, Elk Refuge typically has them, Antelope Flats typically has them. They're out there feeding on windblown seeds for the most part. Gray-crowned rosy finch come down from the altitude to come to your feeder. Beautiful birds. Rarely, I think we get a black rosy finch with them, but gray crowns are by far the most common. European starling. In the spring, these are beautiful birds in the spring. They often are very shiny plumaged. It actually looks more like a spring picture. The winter, they tend to be, no, I guess it's good light. They're pretty brown, but the bills are pointed and they flock. And generally, you don't see one, you see 100. And there you go. I'll take a couple of questions,
Very
but
good. So tell us, why do birds fly?
thanks, Wes. Because somebody's got to do it, Wes. What? Can you be a little more specific? You're muted. Still muted.
You may have to click something for him, Bernie. I had this problem earlier today in Zoom. You
Hang
might
on a
have
minute.
to
Maybe I can-
offer him to unmute.
Who is it?
It's Wes Timmerman.
Yeah, we're back on.
Okay, there we go. So, okay, you're muted again now.
Oh, I'll stay unmuted then. Okay.
Yeah, stay unmuted. So Wes, I guess I'm curious as to, you know, a little bit deeper into the question.
Yeah, well, as I said, I had nothing intelligent to say, so I just opened my mouth and, some.
You know, the short answer is the aerial habitat is open. Something's going to fill it, and of course, birds aren't the only animals that fly. You know, we've got bats, and then we've got a few species that are almost pre-flight. But it's a great, I think the more difficult question is, why do birds migrate? And they migrate to take advantage of open habitats and predator-free and food-rich environments.
Yeah, that also has to do with plate tectonics too.
49 people.
I'm going to leave plate tectonics questions to Bob Smith.
I'm Abigail. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, hey.
Oh, hi. Yes, I want to ask a question, very elementary question, is that I a lot of times see crows and ravens, and sometimes I see an osprey, and sometimes I see an eagle, but I just don't see any of these birds. And it must be that my eye is not, it hasn't been trained on seeing birds. So I do go over to the park and see the trumpeter swans.
Yeah.
But I just don't, maybe I don't have that adaptation of seeing birds.
So Sid, is it flying birds that are a question? Oh, I'm sorry, not Sid, but
I think any birds, sometimes I do see them at the bird feeder, but
Yeah.
we have no birds, just deer at the bird feeders right now.
a lot of times that can be a pattern recognition thing. It depends. If you can pick patterns out, you can usually see birds. But if you have a problem seeing, picking patterns out of a background or something like that, then sometimes it's hard to see birds. They are camouflaged. I mean, even the brightly colored birds, that's a secondary sexual characteristic, but it primarily has to do with breaking up what a predator might see in the background. It has to do with breaking up the pattern. And that probably works with us too. So some people are very good at spotting birds. I'm not great at it. I see birds in flight pretty well, But for me to pick out forest birds, it can be very challenging.
Do you just practice?
Not as much as I should, but yeah, practice is what it takes. And I go out in the field with the attitude that I'm not going to be able to recognize more than half the birds that I see. And you just have to let it go.
Yeah, Abby, I get to, because I've got the plant eye, I can usually pick out where the bird is, but I can never tell what the heck it is. So often I will point it out to Bernie and I say it's over there, and hopefully he can zero in, and then he tells me what it is. But I think it's really because I've been looking at plants for so long, and even the texture and the little bumps and the odd things stick out that I've developed over the years.
What I've found is I photograph birds.
Yeah.
And I generally, there's some obvious things that you can identify immediately, but almost all the ones that you just showed, the only way that I see them and identify them is later when I look at the photograph.
Yeah. No, I don't have the patience for photography, Sid. I'm just way too flitty for that. But yeah, it's a great way of identifying birds. I've been getting a lot of photographs from Dennis lately, and that helps me. Oh, yeah, Joe, what's up?
Bernie, it was about a year ago you gave a very similar presentation to this of this program over at the library.
Yep.
And I had asked you, do all of the finches have that forked tail? And I did listen. Your answer was yes. But I noticed tonight when you got to the pine siskin that they had a forked tail.
Yeah, they do actually. That picture really didn't show it, but these tails are basically two sets of feathers that slightly diverge. And presumably it's a flight characteristic. I don't think it's not an exaggerated secondary sexual characteristic like a scissor-tailed flycatcher or a lyrebird. It's strictly for flight because they are quick flyers and they need to be able to break fast to get into the trees. And I think the forked tail, but yeah, it's characteristic of the finches. Anybody else? Well, this is great, folks. And I want to thank you all for joining us. Hopefully next year we'll get the Susans back to be able to give you a more polished presentation. But it's nice to be able to have the library helping us out with Bird Club, and we're going to keep it going. And one of these days we'll be able to get together. So,
Look forward to it.
and remember, if you want to participate in Bird Club, in the bird count on the 19th, shoot me an email and I'll pass it along to Susan Marsh and put you in touch with her.
Ernie,
Yeah.
I have a quick question on that. I actually live in Idaho Falls, but I have a place in Jackson on West Grovant Butte.
Okay.
I normally do the bird count here in Idaho Falls, but I'm going to be kind of in between places.
Okay.
So do you have a real need for volunteers in Jackson this year, or are you pretty well set?
I don't know, Susan. You'd have to ask Susan Marsh.
Okay.
And so if you want to shoot me an email at jhbirdclub@gmail, I'll pass it along to Susan. I don't know where she is on getting the routes covered.
Okay. All right. I'll do that.
I'd love to have you.
I think in a recent email from Susan that she said that they do need more volunteers. So
Okay.
it may be helpful. And we sent our request in for Spring Gulch again this year,
Yeah.
just to her recently. So
Okay. Well, I'll put you in touch with her, Susan.
Okay. Thank you.
And my goal is to not waste anybody's time and get us done in an hour. And we are